Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Aurelio Villatoro wash processed Guatemala from La Barba Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And La Barba, based out of Salt Lake City, Utah. And this coffee was a suggestion to us by Simon, so shout out to and thank you to Simon for the suggestion. This is La Barba's first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had a little bit of familiarity with going into this review. And that's why I found it pretty interesting that Simon suggested this coffee to us, as it has been about 10 years since I've last had any of La Barba's coffees. So I took a look at it, and not only did it sound like my type of coffee, but it also sounded pretty interesting. So I figured we'd give it a shot, and we'll see how it's turned out, as this right here is day 38. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So this one's definitely a little bit more developed than we typically review, though I would say that it is perhaps slightly lighter than a true medium in terms of that roast profile, as even then I definitely have to say that a lot of people would more closely align this with being on the medium side of things, and I feel like that's probably the best way to gauge it, if maybe slightly lighter than that. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 12, first impression, and as mentioned, it was notably more developed as expected based off of the previous experiences I'd had with this coffee roaster. It did lend itself towards a much more robust profile. There are highlights to the cup, as it does have plenty of fruit depth underneath the roastier qualities, as the listed mango felt very apt in a strong stone fruit aspect sense. Slight fruit brightness as well, but the roastiness was mostly holding back the rest of the cup, so kind of mixed first impression off this coffee. We move on to day 15 as we opted for the Chemex, and there was plenty of development felt yet again, as there's a fair bit of smokiness at the forefront and in the finish, but there's some nice definition to the fruit profile, and that's something that I did want to highlight and focus on, especially with this coffee, as it came out in a much more notable and sweeter stone fruit sense, but also some really nice apple brightness. Minus the roastiness, a lot of the qualities in this are very well pronounced and also have some really nice definition to them, so definitely some positives to take away if maybe perhaps you don't mind that slightly more roasty, smoky profile to the coffee. Day 20 through the April brewer, and the cup felt notably less intense, as it still does offer some nice definition to stone fruit aspects, just in a much more subtle manner. Otherwise, the cup has remained pretty consistent with a slight tart apple brightness to it yet again. Day 23 lowered the temperatures, and you can really feel a fair bit of these smoky qualities to the point where there's definitely a bit of roastiness in the cup. And that's one thing I was wondering, was if we did tone down the temperatures, then perhaps would we get a little less of that smokiness, a little less of that roasty quality. And yes, we did, but at the cost of what was much of the fruit profiles that were present on the earlier days. So the trade-off at this time didn't necessarily feel worth it, as it did have a surprisingly sweet and defined apple-like tone to the cup yet again. A bit of the classic caramelized sugar sense to it, so it was decent, but skewing perhaps a little bit away from the direction that I'd enjoyed up to this point. Day 26 through the Chemex with the same adjustments and a lot of similarities to the previous day, as there's much more of a pronounced fruit aspect, and the pronounced fruit aspects are continued to be significantly dialed back, with much more of the roasty qualities also present. The front of the cup has a strong smokiness, complemented slightly by the lingering fruit characteristics, but outside of that, that kind of roastier, smokier profile seemed to be dominating the qualities of this coffee. Day 29 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and this was better. So once again, this is often what I come to with a lot of these more developed coffees is the trade-off worth it for me? Is toning down some of the smokier, roastier qualities at the cost of maybe some of the more enjoyable profiles of this coffee really worth it? And in this one I said, no, I really enjoyed a lot of the mango-like aspects of this one, so decided to go back the other way, and it was worth the trade-off, as there were more of these sweeter stone fruits present yet again, more of the caramelized aspect with the apple brightness yet again. So this coffee, at least in terms of the overall profile of it, has been very consistent. I wouldn't necessarily say that there's too much depth in it. A lot of the qualities are going to be present throughout, mostly the smoky roastier quality, that very defined and pronounced mango stone fruit quality, as well as that fruit brightness and the caramelized aspect to it. Day 32 felt like a little bit of a resurgence for this coffee as we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it's the best it's been up to this point with a high sweet stone fruit and more of the apple brightness yet again. A bit of allspice, chocolate, and caramelized aspects, so on this day I was getting just a slight bit more depth to it, so a little better in that regard. And then day 35, final notes we have. Pretty similar results to the previous day with a notable level of fruit aspects yet again, most specifically and most pronounced, of course, being that mango-like attribute to it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 4 level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the finish level 4. So the finish is going to be ever so slightly marred by the fact that it does have a little bit of that lingering smoky roasty quality to the cup, and I feel like that did take away from some of the more enjoyable aspects of it. I actually really enjoyed the kind of fruit brightness that was present within this one, so if I was able to get maybe a little bit more of that without this smokier quality to it, then perhaps it might have been a much more enjoyable finish to the cup. Outside of that though, not necessarily my favorite part of this coffee. Acidity, level 4. And this was hovering somewhere between the 3 and the 4, but I said I'm feeling enough brightness underneath all of these smoky qualities to kind of justify that level 4 mark. And I feel like that's one of the things that made this coffee maybe a little bit more interesting than just a medium profiled Guatemalan coffee, as it did offer that brightness and really nice definition to some of the other fruit profiles in it, which we'll go through next. Citrus fruit at that level 4. And as I kind of mentioned, I really appreciated the fact that they did have the apple note list on here, given it's very defined. It's one of the more defined aspects of this coffee, and I really appreciated that from start to finish. Next up, we have the stone fruit level 4, and that's the first thing I noticed about this coffee after the smokier, roastier qualities was that very well-defined stone fruit, that mango-like aspect that was present within this one, especially in a slightly more sweeter sense. And given just how clear that was shining through a lot of those more developed qualities, I had a great appreciation for that. As I've experienced this in some more developed coffees, usually it's a little bit more a peachy sense, but given that this had a little bit more of a sugary stone fruit aspect, I just appreciated the uniqueness of that quality. All right, then we have a handful of level 3s. We'll start with the sweetness level 3. And I made this tasting wheel twice, and the first time I said level 4, and then I thought about it and I said, as I'm drinking this coffee, I don't know if I can justify level 4. That's usually reserved for coffees a little bit sweeter than this one, so I bumped that one down, though I would say it's hovering again there in that higher side of level 3, lower side of level 4, somewhere in between. So it does have a fair bit of sweetness, mostly coming from the caramelized aspects to chocolate aspects, but also that stone fruit-like component. Chocolate level 3. And this has plenty of the classic Central American coffee qualities to it, including that chocolate caramelized aspect. You see both of those present within this tasting wheel, scoring at that level 3 mark. I would say that the more we were consuming this coffee, the more present and prominent both of those characteristics became. And I think a lot of those were kind of competing with the other qualities that we're going to be discussing, which is the smokiness at that level 3. And obviously that's going to be one of the biggest things hindering this coffee for me because of just how much that kind of took away from the other enjoyable profiles of this. It kind of took away the overall clarity to it, and that's going to be demonstrated when we discuss the cleanliness to it. But smokiness, it's a little bit more on that medium scale. Again, that's the development of this coffee. Bitterness, level 3. And unfortunately for me, that is the coffee bitterness. And I really don't like scoring the bitterness at that mark, especially when it is the coffee bitter qualities as opposed to like a citric bitterness or any sort of additional bitterness. So yeah, it does have a little bit of those kind of coffee bitter qualities, scoring it there at that level 3 mark. Body level 3, medium bodied cup of coffee. Interesting, obviously, given that we opted for the Chemex, but that just goes to show that this coffee is always going to skew a little bit more on the texture body side of things with it. And then final level 3 and final thing we're discussing is the cleanliness. And I do appreciate that we saved that one for last, as obviously it was marred ever so slightly by the smokier, roastier qualities of this coffee. Because outside of that, it's definitely scoring that level 4, mostly because of just how much definition there is, especially to the fruit qualities within this coffee. So if that one attribute hadn't necessarily held it back, then I can definitely say that I really enjoyed the overall cleanliness and clarity of it. But the roastier qualities is always going to kind of take away from the overall cleanliness of a cup of coffee. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I do appreciate that by the end it did have a little bit of a redemption arc, as the last couple of days were much better than the days that preceded it. But with that being said, obviously it's going to be held back ever so slightly by a profile that's not necessarily in line with my own. Now, while the coffee did sound like the type of coffee I would enjoy, obviously if it's roasted to a degree that's not not in line with my own preferences, then it's always going to kind of hinder the overall potential that it could have for me anyway. And it's a little bit of a shame because I really appreciated a lot of the qualities that's within this coffee, but I know for a lot of people, a lot of the more, we'll just say, lighter profile qualities, so the grassiness, the overall just really strong, bright citric and bright aspects of coffees can kind of take away from them. And I know for other people on the other side of the spectrum, it can really bother you to have a little bit of even some slight roasty qualities to it. And I still find myself somewhere in the middle where usually it's not too bad of a deal if the rest of the coffee makes up for those things. And I would say that this one maybe came close, but at the end of the day, there was just perhaps a little bit too much development, a little bit too much smokiness and roastiness for me to enjoy it. But that does kind of transition into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you do like your much more medium profiled coffees, then I feel like this is a good place to start, as not only did it offer plenty of those classic attributes, a little bit more body, a little bit more of that, we'll just say classic coffee taste, chocolate, caramelized aspects, but in addition to that, it offered some interesting qualities, at least in regards to the fruit qualities of it. So that, of course, being that very well-defined mango aspect. And maybe you just seem to enjoy those coffees a little bit more as, yeah, the brightness scored a level 4, but that was a slightly generous level 4. So maybe toned down on the brightness while still offering a little bit of an interesting fruit profile to it. Then I feel like this one's a very good fit for you, but I also feel like that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Aurelio Villatoro wash processed Guatemala from Barba Coffee. Thank you for watching.